They feared tanks. They feared terrorists. Now, they fear teenagers in Ouagadougou with smartphones. The tremor-shaking Western capitals isn't launched from a missile. It's broadcast through a live stream. It isn't cloaked in camouflage. It wears sandals and speaks in dialects long silenced by imperial tongues. In Burkina Faso, a new leader rose, young, unyielding, unapologetic. But this story isn't just about a man. It's about a soil reclaiming its seed, a continent tilting toward its own sun. For centuries, Africa fed the world's factories and fields, but never its own future. That era is ending, and the fear isn't chaos. The fear is clarity, the kind that says, this land will no longer bleed for you. Stay with us. This is not a trend. This is the tectonic shift that could redraw the global order. Subscribe and walk with us. Because if this is the dawn of a truly anti-colonial Africa, then what comes next will not be televised. It will be authored. It did not begin with a grand declaration. It began with silence, the kind that comes before a storm. In August 2022, the streets of Ouagadougou trembled not with fear, but with certainty. Young soldiers marched, crowds gathered, flags changed, and in the chaos of coups, something ancient stirred, a longing not for power, but for purpose. Ibrahim Traoré was 34. Too young, they said. But perhaps that was the point. He hadn't lived through the old arrangements. He hadn't been trained to obey the invisible lines drawn by foreign maps. Instead, he brought a compass of his own, calibrated to dignity, not dependency. He didn't arrive with ideology. He arrived with questions. Why should the land that holds gold watch its children starve? Why should the people who own the soil kneel to outsiders who've never touched it? Why should Africa export life and import crumbs? The answers didn't come from textbooks. They came from trenches, from the miners paid in dust, from farmers priced out of their own harvest, from students who saw more hope on TikTok than in government policy. And so a fire lit, not in violence, but in vision. Traoré expelled French troops, not to declare war, but to reclaim breath. He did not burn flags. He planted policy. He tore up mining contracts that sent 80% of Burkina Faso's gold abroad and returned barely crumbs. He demanded local ownership, local processing, local pride. But this wasn't just about metal, it was about memory. Traoré invoked the name of Thomas Sankara, the iconic revolutionary who in just 4 years during the 1980s made Burkina Faso food self-sufficient, planted 10 million trees, and taught an entire nation to believe in itself. Sankara had been murdered in a coup backed by foreign interests, his dreams buried beneath aid packages. But dreams, like seeds, don't die. They wait. And Traoré, with the swagger of youth and the silence of ancestors, unearthed them. He didn't speak in anti-West slogans. He spoke in pro-Africa policies. No more raw exports. No more foreign troops dictating domestic policy. No more CFA franc, the colonial currency printed in France, controlling 15 African nations like invisible shackles. And the people? They followed, not blindly, but boldly. Not because they wanted a savior, but because they recognized the soil speaking back. What made this moment different wasn't just what Traoré did, it was where it led. Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea. In quick succession, coups echoed across West Africa, not all identical, not all progressive, but each one, in its own way, breaking with the old script. The Western narrative, instability. The African street, sovereignty. And that's when the fear began. Because if one landlocked nation with a youthful captain could start rewriting colonial contracts, what happens when others read the same manual? What happens when anti-colonial Africa stops protesting and starts governing? What happens when the harvest stays home? And while some saw chaos, others saw coordinates. The beginning of a new continental compass. The coups were local, but the tremors were global. In Paris, London, and Washington, Analysts scrambled for answers. Why was Africa slipping through their fingers? Why were flags once loyal to the West now flying colors unknown to their doctrine? The answer wasn't ideological, it was mathematical, because when Ibrahim Traoré stood before a press corps and declared that Burkina Faso would no longer export raw gold, he wasn't threatening war. He was threatening profit margins. For decades, the arrangement had been simple. Africa extracted, the West enriched. Burkina Faso exported raw ore and in return received debt, dependency, and diplomatic smiles. But now the script was flipped. Under Traoré, the government began setting up infrastructure to refine gold domestically. No more shipping wealth out and buying it back at 10 times the price. No more exporting jobs, opportunity, or pride. The West didn't send armies. They sent headlines. Burkina Faso veers toward extremism. Russia's hand behind military rule. Stability at risk in the Sahel. But on the ground, the picture looked different. Farmers, miners, students, they weren't running from terror. They were walking towards something that had long been denied, agency. And as policies shifted in Ouagadougou, the ripples spread. Mali, already under a transitional military government, began echoing similar sentiments. Niger, after its own coup, joined the anti-French chorus. Guinea voiced ambitions of mining reform. The CFA franc, once untouchable, now felt fragile. Western diplomats called it a crisis. But for many Africans, it felt like closure. It was the long-delayed funeral of a colonial contract. And yet, this wasn't simply about economics. It was about symbolism. Burkina Faso, a country of fewer than 25 million, was confronting empires. Not with tanks, but with truth. By demanding technology transfers from foreign investors, by mandating that local labor be used in foreign-funded projects, by refusing aid strings that strangled autonomy, Traoré wasn't isolating Burkina Faso, he was insulating it. Insulating it from the cyclical trap, resource boom, foreign loans, policy dictates, debt crisis, foreign bailout, repeat. Traoré broke the cycle by cutting the chain. And the youth, they noticed. Social media lit up with support, not just from West Africa, but from the diaspora in Europe, North America, the Caribbean. The slogans weren't anti-white nor anti-Western. They were pro-African, pro-ownership, pro-production, pro-future. But the louder the cheers grew, the darker the narratives became. French media framed Traoré as a dangerous populist. American think tanks warned of destabilization. Even African elites, long trained to echo Western scripts, expressed concern. But concern for whom? When Gaddafi once proposed a gold-backed African currency to challenge the IMF and World Bank, Libya was bombed into chaos. When Patrice Lumumba insisted that Congo's uranium should serve Congolese interests, he was dead within months. Now, Traoré was renegotiating contracts, retaking territory, removing foreign bases. Was it history repeating, or was it revenge reversing? Because this time, something felt different. The information battlefield had shifted. For every Western headline, there was a TikTok reel. For every op-ed warning of instability, there was a WhatsApp message celebrating sovereignty. Burkina Faso wasn't just changing policies, it was changing perception. The nation that once watched its gold leave in silence was now speaking in fluent resistance. And perhaps that's what frightened the West most. Not a rifle, but a narrative. A story they could no longer write. And just as Gaddafi's dream of a gold-backed dinar once shook the world, this new wave carries echoes even deeper. The world called it a coup, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, it looked more like a construction site. Because unlike past revolts that ended in new flags and old policies, this one began building. Within months of seizing power, Traoré's government rolled out initiatives not just to shake the system, but to replace it. The first target? Food. Burkina Faso, despite its fertile soil, imported much of what it ate. Under Traoré, agricultural policy shifted overnight. Fertilizer subsidies were restructured. Local cooperatives were strengthened. Urban youth were offered incentives to return to rural farming. The message was clear: we will not eat from foreign hands while our soil lies idle. And that wasn't just political poetry. It was economic logic. Africa holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet spends over $60 billion each year importing food. Traoré knew sovereignty begins in the stomach. Next came mineral reform. New contracts demanded that mining companies process a portion of raw materials locally. Those unwilling were shown the door. Foreign firms, once operating with impunity, were now subject to audits. Some screamed nationalism. Others saw something else: fairness. For decades, Burkina Faso extracted gold, zinc, manganese, but shipped it abroad raw. The profits, jobs, and technologies left with it. Traoré's model was simple: no value added, no access granted. He wasn't inventing a new system. He was reviving one. In the 1980s, Thomas Sankara implemented similar reforms, building local factories, banning luxury imports, and creating employment from within. But Sankara's flame was extinguished too soon. Traoré now tended to those embers. But unlike Sankara's era, today's Burkina Faso has one weapon the revolutionaries of the past lacked: connectivity. Mobile banking, digital identity systems, blockchain for mining transparency. The tools of sovereignty were no longer rifles and manifestos. They were apps, and the people understood this, especially the youth. University students weren't just protesting, they were proposing. Civil society organizations launched platforms to track public spending. Young coders began developing localization software for schools in Mure and Dioula languages. Farmers used SMS alerts to monitor rainfall. This wasn't nationalism, it was nation-building. And the change wasn't just happening within, it was radiating out. Neighboring countries, long tethered to the CFA franc and economic policies dictated in Brussels and Paris, began asking questions. Why do we pay France to hold our reserves? Why can't we process our own uranium? Why are roads always promised but never paved? The answers pointed toward a new formula, one no longer rooted in charity but in choice. This is where anti-colonial Africa became more than sentiment. It became structure, a blueprint, a policy framework, a strategy that others could copy, not a military doctrine, a development model. Of course, the challenges were immense: infrastructure gaps, capital shortages, security threats, media disinformation. But the momentum was unmistakable. Burkina Faso had moved from resisting oppression to redefining ownership. Ownership not just of land or minerals, but of the future. And herein lies the fear from Western institutions. Because once sovereignty is structured, it becomes scalable. What begins in Ouagadougou can be drafted in Dakar, replicated in Lusaka, localized in Nairobi. And when sovereignty becomes scalable, it becomes contagious. But if the soil was being reclaimed, who would try to scorch it? Across boardrooms and embassies, the language remained careful, measured. We are concerned. We urge a return to constitutional order. We monitor the situation with deep interest. But beneath those diplomatic niceties, panic, because African sovereignty doesn't come with a military parade. It comes with cancelled contracts, with closed bases, with youth waving flags no longer tinged with compromise. France felt it first. Once the unquestioned power in West Africa, its military footprint is now shrinking. Expelled from Mali, dismissed from Burkina Faso, rejected by Niger. One by one, its strongholds were slipping, not to armed enemies, but to civilian courage. And the messages weren't subtle. In Ouagadougou, murals of Thomas Sankara stood defiant. Protesters burned French flags not out of hate, but to ignite memory. The past was being remembered and rewritten. In Washington, think tanks issued policy briefs. They framed the rise of leaders like Traoré as Russian influence, ignoring the deeper truth. This wasn't East versus West. This was Africa versus extraction. Yes, Russia and China entered the vacuum, offering arms, infrastructure, investment. But unlike the West, they often came without lectures. Moscow offered security assistance without demanding political alignment. Beijing built roads without restructuring state budgets. Were their motives pure? No. Were they different? Enough to shift allegiances. But here's what Western observers missed. The youth supporting Traoré weren't waving Russian flags out of loyalty. They were waving African ones out of logic. They weren't anti-West. They were post-West. And while Western media insisted on seeing foreign manipulation, what they failed to see was indigenous motivation. A generation that read Sankara on WhatsApp, watched Lumumba speeches on YouTube, and shared Gaddafi's vision through Instagram Reels. Even institutions like the African Union and ECOWAS, once viewed as neutral, were now seen as echo chambers of foreign policy. Their condemnations of coups rang hollow to populations who had never tasted democracy, only dependency. Meanwhile, grassroots movements flourished. Pan-African youth collectives, decentralized media outlets, sovereignty forums held online and offline, connecting Accra to Algiers, Kigali to Kinshasa. And the Western response: censorship, sanctions, silence. Because it was no longer a battle for territory. It was a battle for narrative. And in silence, Washington's biggest fear is whispered in boardrooms. What if Africa stops listening? Africa was once carved by railroads that led only outward, to ports, to ships, to foreign markets. Today, it is laying down new tracks, not of steel, but of sovereign code. In Ghana, solar farms are lighting villages once forgotten. In Kenya, mobile money connects millions to banking. In Rwanda, drone delivery networks reach hills where roads never did. And in Burkina Faso, a quiet revolution unfolds, not in shouts, but in systems. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just chase out troops. He invited in transfer of technology on African terms. He rejected aid packages tied to policy changes and chose partnerships that respect autonomy. Gold is now refined at home. Food is grown and consumed within borders. Contracts are signed in local languages and scrutinized by local citizens. But this is not isolationism. This is intelligent integration. Through the African Continental Free Trade Area, Burkina Faso is positioning itself not as an island, but as a bridge, connecting West Africa's ambition to Central Africa's resources and East Africa's technology. And the youth, they're not waiting for permission. From Accra to Addis Ababa, they code apps, build solar grids, start podcasts, launch fintechs. They speak French, English, Wolof, Swahili, but more importantly, they speak sovereignty. This is the Africa that is coming, not begging for inclusion, but designing its own systems. And it frightens those who once dictated the rules, because it proves that you don't need to defeat the West militarily, you can outgrow its narrative. It proves that you don't have to copy Asia or the EU, you can build your own blueprint. And above all, it proves that anti-colonial Africa is not a protest. It is a proposition for a world where justice isn't requested but built. And in this whisper of wind and fiber optic wire, the world hears a question. What if Africa leads? This is no longer about rebellion. It is about rebirth. For too long, Africa was spoken of in past tense, as a place of tragedy, turmoil, and perpetual promise. But now, it speaks in the present, and more dangerously, in the future tense. What began in the red dust of Burkina Faso is no longer confined to its borders. It is spreading, not as fire, but as fertility. A seed sown in sovereignty, watered by youth, rooted in truth. This is the completion of a journey interrupted. The second half of the decolonization equation, where political flags are joined by economic tools, where independence is not a holiday, but a harvest. Anti-colonial Africa is no longer angry protest. It is quiet precision. It is policy that refuses crumbs, contracts that demand equity, curricula that teach Sankara as more than a footnote, currency that stays home. And yes, It is frightening because the global economy, as we know it, was built not just on African resources, but on African silence. That silence is over. African sovereignty is not born of rage, but of rhythm. A rhythm set by the feet of marchers in Bamako, by the keystrokes of coders in Nairobi, by the heartbeat of miners reclaiming their hills in Kedugu. It is not anti-West. It is post-dependency. It asks only one thing, that Africa be allowed to own its tomorrow. The choice is here. It is loud. It is irreversible. Support leaders like Traoré, not because they shout, but because they build. Not because they resist the world, but because they reimagine it. If this resonates with your hope, don't scroll. Subscribe, share, join us, because anti-colonial Africa is rising, and African sovereignty is not a dream. It is the deadline.